Good morning. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm in the Atlanta area. Today we're going to be discussing what should every leader know. It's about crisis intuition. Our presenter today is Guy Higgins. We'll be talking more about him later. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series of the University of Alabama College of Continuing Studies. We'd like to have you become our friend on Facebook. Firestorm Solutions is our Facebook account. You can follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. Yes, there's a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage crisis and risk. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, consequence management. We are America's crisis coach. This presentation is not complete today without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And please use your advice from your corporation's or organization's personal counsel to evaluate the information that we present. This information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. University of Alabama, Bama at Work, has been a sponsor of Firestorm for several years now. We're delighted to have the relationship that we have with them. Our normal contact, Brenda Truelove, is recovering from a minor surgical procedure. And so we'd like to just remind you about some things that we can tell you about. The Crimson Lean Six Sigma blended learning starts there. We do black belt, transitional green belt, all of these wonderful things. You can go to the College of Continuing Studies at the University of Alabama and you can register for these webinars and the events. You can do them online, and there are also some additional things that you can do in person. The workshop leads for these, Diana Rocket and Michael Sullivan. These are good, qualified people. University of Alabama does a marvelous job in their presentations. You learn about the knowledge of the theory, composition of the Lean Six Sigma program. You develop proficiency in the basic analytical tools. You learn team leadership and project management skills and the skills necessary to lead a complex process improvement. You can go to sixsigma.ua.edu, and you can also register by phone 205-348-3000. And you can also contact our good friend Brenda Truelove at truelove@ccs.eua.edu. That's Brenda Truelove there. Okay, our presenter today is Guy Higgins. Guy is a principal of Firestorm for several times. He and his associate Jennifer Friedman have been our franchisees of the year. Guy has an extensive background in aerospace. He's a graduate of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he is a flyboy, among other wonderful things. And this is his third career. Guy, over to you, please.
Okay, Bill, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and welcome to everybody who has joined us this morning. Today we're going to talk about leadership in crisis, and to get started I want to tell you about a situation of leadership under pressure, leadership in crisis. A little over 100 years ago, Ernest Shackleton conceived of an expedition from Britain to the Antarctic and to cross the Antarctic continent on foot. And he assembled his expedition, and they sailed from England in the late summer of 1914. They sailed from the United Kingdom down to the Falkland Islands, New South Georgia. They stopped there to replenish supplies and to acquire some intelligence on the conditions that the locals in the Falklands had been experiencing. They were told that the preceding spring had been one of the coldest on record, and that the sea ice around Antarctica was the worst that anyone could remember seeing it, and that the expectations were that the coming summer would not be any better than the spring had been. Nonetheless, Shackleton took his expedition in their sailing ship and sailed down towards Antarctica, and they became trapped in sea ice. And the photograph that you see there is the expedition standing on that frozen sea ice at the bow of their ship. The ship was caught in the ice, and they spent 6 or 7 weeks waiting patiently for warming conditions to break up the sea ice so that they could continue the expedition. Didn't happen that way. The sea ice continued to build, the weather got colder, and the ice began to compress the ship, eventually forcing it up out of the ice and crushing the hull. So at this point, the expedition is not going to happen the way it was planned, and they are in crisis. Shackleton and his expedition took one of those longboats, the lifeboats on the ship, loaded it with all the emergency supplies that they could, and dragged it on foot across the sea ice to Elephant Island. At Elephant Island, which is uninhabited, still is, at Elephant Island, Shackleton picked several members of his crew to accompany him. They rigged a mast and a sail in the longboat, loaded it with the minimum of supplies, and sailed the boat through the Antarctic Ocean back to the Falklands, about 1,200 miles. The weather through which, the seas and the weather through which they sailed that longboat were absolutely horrendous. It's the worst weather in the world. As an example, when Captain Cook was going to sail from England to Tahiti to pick up breadfruit, he tried to round the Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, and he tried for 2 months to sail through those seas and gave up because it was too hard, so he sailed the other way around the world to Tahiti. And he was in a ship, not in an open longboat. So Shackleton and a couple of his men sailed that longboat back to New South Georgia, landed on the south shore of the island, crossed the mountain range in the middle of the island, went down to the colony, organized a rescue expedition, went back to Elephant Island, rescued the men. Every single participant in that expedition survived the expedition, and Shackleton was knighted for his leadership in making sure that everybody survived that expedition. So the question is that an example of good leadership? Well, Shackleton did an amazing job of getting his people out of a very, very bad situation, and he did a very, very bad job by getting his people into that situation. I personally do not think that he exhibited good leadership overall as a leader of the expedition, because he apparently had no plan for the what if. What if we get down there and things are really bad? Will we continue? Will we back off? What happens if we get... He didn't have plans for any of those what if things, and he was unprepared and had to do it in an ad hoc manner. Now, he was marvelously successful in that, but that's not the way to plan things. So today, we're going to talk about 6 case studies, 3 pairs, and we're going to look at considerations. Were the leaders in these situations, in these cases, under pressure? What was the source of the pressure? Was it the media, the press? Was it the situation itself? Was decision-making easy or difficult? Were there ethical challenges, and were they able to manage consequences? I'm going to talk about a pair of case studies, the Malaysia Air Flight 370 that disappeared several years ago, and a Air Asia crash, fatal crash shortly thereafter. Then we're going to look at British Petroleum and the disaster they had in the Gulf of Mexico, and contrast that with a Chevron oil refinery fire. Finally, we're going to look at an evacuation that Louisiana State University had from their campus and compare how well that went with an incident at Chardon High School in Ohio. So, without further ado, let's talk about Malaysia Air Flight MH370. As indicated on the chart, the map there on the right-hand side of this slide, they took off from Kuala Lumpur in a Boeing 777, and they flew for about an hour under air traffic control in Malaysia, and at that time the civilian air traffic control lost contact with the airplane. This is not a good thing. So the Malaysian government, which is the sponsor of Malaysia Air as a state airline, got on the media and began to tell people what they knew or what they thought they knew. And there was enormous pressure on these folks because it's a state-sponsored airline, and they did not want to come out and indicate in any way that they had permitted unsafe operations or that they were in less than complete control of the safety and security of the airline. So they stated that they'd lost radar contact and allowed themselves to speculate a little bit about what was happening. They talked about what they would do to look for the airplane. Then they found out that military radar maintained contact with the airplane for about another hour. And then it too lost contact with the airplane, and reluctantly admitted that they had maintained radar contact longer than they had previously said, but they had now lost it in the Gulf of Thailand and thought that perhaps the aircraft had gone down. Well, it turned out that the aircraft itself, not the people on board it, but the aircraft itself had continued to transmit telemetry maintenance data, system status data, back to the ground via satellite, and that data was used subsequently to permit people to reconstruct the track that you see there with final loss of contact at about 6:20 Greenwich Mean Time. So once again, the government came out and made statements and made assumptions and assertions that they then had to walk back. They were primarily talking to people about how they would find the airplane, and they evinced no indications of having planned for the loss of an airplane. Decision-making was really hard for them because they hadn't apparently thought about these things. Now, there are ethical challenges. We had 270 plus human beings on that airplane, and the government of Malaysia talked about the airplane much more than they talked about the 270 people on board that airplane. And of course, the media talked about the people on board that airplane because human interest stories draw much more attention and better ratings than does the loss of an airplane. The government of Malaysia, Malaysia Air, was not able to manage consequences. They lost ridership, they lost revenue, and in fact, they're only now, years later, beginning to recover their reputation. Their brand and reputation was terribly impacted by that incident. On the other hand, AirAsia, which is a low-cost, privately held airline in Asia, had about 2 or 3 months after the Malaysia Air incident, had a crash shortly after takeoff. Now, there were differences. AirAsia knew what happened. They knew the airplane crashed, and they were certain that there were some fatalities. AirAsia began to communicate instantly, and their behavior indicates that they had a plan and they had messages that they wanted to send out. They started contacting families and emergency contact points and to let them know, here's what we know. We know the airplane crashed. We assume that there are fatalities, but we don't know, and we'll let you know as soon as we can. They assembled the people at the departure point and established an emergency operations center there. The chief executive officer flew to the emergency operations center, began talking with the people there both as a group and individually. They contacted people at the destination, offered to fly them down to the departure point where the emergency operations center was, and to provide them with lodging and food during the days after the incident so that they could continue to be informed of the status. And they continued to talk to them, told them information as they were able to find out about it and verify it, and they did a good job of managing the consequences. Now, were they under pressure? Sure, they were under pressure. There's been an accident here. There's almost certainly fatalities, and there were over 170 fatalities. That makes it a very pressure-filled situation. But their decision-making seemed to have been a great deal easier because it's apparent that they had a plan in place and had thought about what they were going to do. They weren't trying to do this thing in an ad hoc manner. They weren't having to demonstrate superhuman leadership abilities. They followed their plan and did it, and they had thought through the ethical challenges. So they weren't having to decide these very difficult kinds of things under the pressure of the moment with the spotlight of the international press on them. Now let's look at BP and Chevron. I think most people are going to remember the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico several years ago, where Chevron or BP had a blowout and subsequent explosion and fire on a drilling platform. There were 11 fatalities associated with that, and the release of petroleum from the wellhead into the Gulf of Mexico. BP began communicating, and it once again appears that they had not thought about how they would deal with this. The CEO became a very visible spokesman for the company, and that's not always the best plan. CEOs, while they generally have media training, generally are not as expert as their media professionals. The CEO was on the media, and he made a statement that said, "No one wants this to end any faster than I do. I just want my life back." Well, the 11 people that were on that drilling platform probably wanted their lives back too, as did their families. Bad statement, indicative of not having thought through these things ahead of time. The pressure was enormous. BP was very optimistic about how low the discharge of oil was into the Gulf, about how quickly they would get the well cap, about how soon this would be, the environmental damage would be controlled, and they continued to have to walk those statements back day after day. It's going to take longer. There's more oil being discharged into the Gulf. It's going to take longer. There's more oil than we told you being discharged into the Gulf. The rate is higher than we had said it was. Enormous pressure from the residents all along the Gulf Coast, from the Congress of the United States, from the media. Everyone is really leaning on BP, and their decision making was very difficult. They tried to paint a rosier picture than they had evidence for. There's nothing wrong with being optimistic, but it's important to be transparent and honest about what you know and what you think. Were there ethical challenges? Certainly. 11 people were dead. Enormous environmental damage is occurring. So huge ethical challenges, and once again, BP painted this very optimistically. And as a result, they had to walk it back a lot of times, damaging their reputation, damaging their brand, and they did not manage their consequences. I think most people still see occasional British Petroleum commercials on television talking about how environmentally committed they are. They're still trying to retrieve their reputation. On the other hand, Chevron, an oil refinery in Southern California, experienced an explosion and a fire, and that's the photograph that you can see on this slide. Chevron, unlike BP, did not rely only on press conferences and press releases. Chevron got on Twitter, and in 140 or fewer characters, they began to tell people what was going on. We've had an explosion at our Long Beach oil refinery. We'll let you know what's happening. First responders are on the scene and working to contain the fire. There are no known fatalities. We don't know about injuries. We believe the fire will be contained within the next 2 or 3 hours. They continue to put these things out in addition to the more traditional means of doing it, and they committed to fixing environmental issues. You can see the smoke that's coming from the fire there in Long Beach, and that smoke is going to stay in the LA basin for a long, long time because of the local environmental conditions. It just holds stuff in the air there in the LA basin. They committed to making that well again, making it whole. They committed to addressing any injuries. They talked about it. They were up front. They held press conferences. They had media professionals speaking to people. They had the first responders and local Long Beach government talking to the people. They did an excellent job. And once again, were they under pressure? Of course they were. If there's any place in the world that's environmentally sensitive, it's Southern California. Did that make decision making? that make the decisions they made easier or difficult? Well, it puts pressure on them, but they apparently thought through all of these things, and so they were able to execute decisions that they had basically already made. They were able to execute them, and so they were able to act more quickly and more effectively. Were they faced with ethical challenges? Certainly. The environmental damage alone poses a real issue, and they could have taken an optimistic perspective and said, you know, that the smoke is going to dissipate out to sea in the next day or so. That's not what they did. They said, we'll find out how bad it is and we'll fix it. And they managed the consequences. Unlike BP, Chevron suffered no long-term adverse consequences from this fire. It's a smaller situation, but nonetheless it was handled much, much more effectively. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of situations here involving educational institutions. A few years ago, there were a number of bomb threats on college and university campuses across the United States. Among those, late in this series of bomb threats, was a bomb threat made at LSU. Now, LSU apparently had a plan, because as soon as they got the bomb threat, they came out on Twitter and said, the tweet that you see there, a bomb threat's been reported to the LSU campus. Please evacuate as calmly and quickly as possible. Check lsu.edu for updates, and it's from the Emergency Operations Center. Good for them. Now, the Louisiana State campus is about 360 acres. No matter how you lay out that 360 acres, nowhere is anyone on that campus more than 400 or 500 yards from being off campus. Almost every single person on that campus could have, within a few minutes, walk off campus. However, this being the United States of America, everybody got the tweet, everybody went out and jumped in their car and joined the world's longest linear parking lot. You can see the photograph there of cars trying to drive off the LSU campus in the middle of the day. It took hours for that traffic jam to clear. That traffic jam prevented people from quickly evacuating the campus. It prevented first responders from getting on the campus, so EOD, explosive ordnance disposal people, EMTs, firemen, policemen had difficulty accessing the campus because of the traffic jam. People who needed to drive off the campus, people who had some kind of an impediment, physical impediment that would prevent them from walking, were denied quick and easy egress from the campus. So LSU, while they had a plan, does not seem to have thought through what would happen, what could happen, because remember, not only did Murphy have his law about anything that can go wrong will go wrong, but he was an optimist. So the existence of a plan is great. Walking through the plan, thinking about the plan, wire brushing the plan, and exercising the plan is equally important. It's really important to do that, because if you don't do it, you don't find out problems like this. Now, Chardon High School, similar to a situation that occurred just this past week, Chardon High School had an armed intruder plan, and they had exercised it. They had taken the staff and faculty, and they had walked through executing their armed intruder plan. Within a week of that exercise, they had an armed intruder event. A student walked into the cafeteria with a firearm and shot a couple of other students. There were faculty members in the cafeteria at the time, and they acted immediately, seized and disarmed the young man, and the incident was effectively over in a couple of minutes. Now, a couple of minutes is important because the average first responder response time is about 7 minutes. That's nationwide, and that's not beating up on first responders. 7 minutes is a phenomenally rapid response time. But Chardon High School was able to end the incident in about 2 minutes. Now, at the same time, they had called 911, they had put the school on lockdown, they disarmed the student. Things were looking really good except for one factor. We have a high school full of teens that are locked down in their classrooms, in rooms around the school, and every one of them has a broadcast station, their smartphone. They immediately get on Twitter and whatever other social media they were on and begin telling people what's going on. There's only one problem with that, is that those students knew nothing about what was going on. They didn't have an overall view from it. That didn't stop them from getting on there. And of course, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CNBC, ABC, CBS, the local media, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, everybody in the world is tweeting back to these students, asking them for comments and giving them 15 seconds of fame. And these students are more than happy to do that. So here we have a burgeoning problem because all sorts of bad information is going out. And in order to fill the 24-hour news cycle, the news media are turning that around with very little skeptical, critical thought being put into it and publishing it. And so here we have a public relations issue burgeoning after the actual incident was well in hand. So once again, the importance of that is to really think through the plans and think about not only what you're going to do to respond to a situation, what the leadership is going to do, but how are you going to deal with communications. So at LSU and at Chardon, was there pressure? Sure. Was decision-making easier or difficult? Well, initially in both cases, decision-making was pretty easy because there were plans in place. It only got difficult when the repercussions of the initial execution of the plan began to unravel. The ethical challenges are still there. How do you deal with, in the case of Chardon High School, how do you deal with the issues of informing parents of the accurate status of what's going on, as opposed to all the tweets that are exploding out of the school? And how do you manage the consequences of those tweets? At LSU, the ethical challenges, the biggest one is associated with the impeding first responders getting in and impeding people who need to be driven off campus from actually exiting the campus. So they have to be thought about and they have to be looked at, and leaders need to go through that and think about that and exercise that ahead of time and really wire brush their plans. So avoid leadership mistakes. The best way to avoid leadership mistakes in crisis is to do what Ernest Shackleton and some of these other folks did not do, which is to lead during the pre-action phase while you're getting ready and thinking about what can go wrong. First thing is to develop a strategy. What approach are we going to have to responding to a situation, to an event, to an emergency? Once we've responded to it, how are we going to recover from it? And what considerations do we need to take? What legal mandates must we respond to? Who do we have to talk to? What do we have to tell them? What regulatory requirements are levied on us? What do we have to do in that area? What are our ethical requirements? How do we be honest and transparent with everyone and provide them with accurate information as quickly as we can? All of those are important things to consider. Once those strategies and considerations are in hand, what are the plans? Let's put the plans down. And the plans need to include not just what to do, but who's going to do it and how it's going to be done. And when we're thinking about who's going to do it, we need to think about who's going to do it when the initial who isn't there. Because emergencies don't pre-schedule themselves and don't make it convenient for us. So we need to make sure that we have who's the alternate, what are they going to do, and how are they going to do it. Firestorm has experience with cases where people have been in the throes of an emergency, run to a telephone, and been unable to recall 911. Got conflicting priorities, and you must be able to manage those conflicting priorities. And that gets back to resources. How do you allocate resources to those priorities in an appropriate manner? And that's really important because preparedness needs to be a priority. It's business as usual and business as unusual. Culture can be a barrier too. It can be a help. It can also be a barrier. And that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. The leadership needs to understand what the culture of the organization is and how that culture can impede preparedness. If your culture is one of being ad hoc problem solvers, like that one quote above, then that's a problem that must be dealt with. Lack of ownership can be a real barrier. And by ownership, I mean people will execute plans that they have helped develop much more enthusiastically and much better than they will execute a plan that they receive from somebody else, because it's their plan as opposed to Fred's plan. And so leadership needs to build that ownership throughout the organization. Make sure that people understand why we're doing this, why it's important, and why your part in it is important, and why we're going to listen to you. Now, legal opinion can also be a barrier. We've had clients whose attorneys said, we don't think that you should have this plan, because if you have this plan, people will expect you to execute that plan perfectly, and if you don't, you're liable to a lawsuit. Well, all of that's true. If you have a plan, people will expect you to follow it. If you don't follow it perfectly, this being the United States of America, you will get sued. But you're going to get sued if you don't have a plan, because you don't have a plan. And you're in a much more defensible position if you have a plan and executed it to the best of your ability during the actual event than if you don't have one. And once again, legal opinion is legal opinion, but it can be a barrier. Overcoming them, participative leadership. I think most organizations in the United States today have begun to accept the fact the boss at the top of the hierarchical pyramid doesn't know everything. And in developing preparedness, the boss, unlike the CEO at VP, needs to reach out to his professionals or her professionals and involve them in the leading the development of the preparedness effort. Communication. Talk to people about, like I said, what's being done to develop preparedness, what's being done to be resilient, why it's being done, why it's important to them. There's that huge what's in it for me question that needs to be answered. So with them. Okay, so once we have explaining that to them with transparency and follow through, people will come on board and help overcome those barriers. And it's easier for a group of people to overcome the barriers than it is for the boss in the corner office. Follow through. Once the plan's in place, go back and recognize communication was about what we're doing and why we're doing it, so follow through to make sure that you underscore that and emphasize that by developing experience in executing the plans. And all of those things build ownership. We predict what can go wrong, how likely it is, and what the impact is. We plan for those, and then we train and exercise so that we can perform if we ever have to. What does that do as far as leadership and performance during a crisis? Just like professional athletes build muscle memory because they have a game plan and they practiced it, having a preparedness plan and practicing it builds that equivalent of muscle memory. Yes, I've had this experience before. I can act quickly because I know what I did then and I know how it worked out. That muscle memory from those exercises and from the training helps us to build intuition. Intuition is not some magic thing that happens to some people and not to others. Intuition is our ability to make decisions very quickly because we have a body of experience in the situation with which we're dealing. And it's that experience that allows us to act in a, quote, intuitive manner. So the muscle memory, the experience, the intuition allows us to build confidence in what we're doing and to operate more quickly, more effectively, more efficiently, and all of that comes together in better performance during crisis. And it's leadership's job to make sure that these things happen. And we have exercises to develop muscle memory, that we have enough of them to build intuition, that those combine to build confidence in our teams, that we have after action reviews and hot washes to go over and learn from it, that we actually learn lessons and don't just observe and admire them, but that we learn those and feed them back into the plans so that we can perform better. So during pre-action, leaders need to create their team. Who's going to be the number one person to do these things? Who's going to be their alternate? What's the plan? Scrub the plan. Make sure the plan's the best it can be. Train on the plan. And then create the experience that builds that muscle memory, the intuition, and the confidence. Then during a crisis, that muscle memory takes over. The intuition comes into play. The confidence manifests itself. People perform better. and you don't have to go grab your longboat and rig a sail and sail through 1,200 miles of the worst weather in the world in order to climb over a mountain chain so that you can put together a rescue expedition. You know, Ernest Shackleton from the very beginning of this webinar did a great job when it came down to the really hard part of this thing, but he should never have gotten there. Our job as leaders is to obviate the need for superhuman leadership. So, what's next? There is a brief that will be on the Firestorm website. You can go to the Firestorm website and look there at recorded webinars and briefs, and you can download the brief and capture the essence of this webinar, and you can review the recording and listen to my dulcet tones yet again. So with that, here's the general information for the continuing education at the University of Alabama. And Bill, do we have any questions?
There are no questions, Guy.
Well, I have either dazzled them with brilliance or baffled them. So thank you, everybody.
Join us again next month for this. Thank you very much, Guy. Bye.
Okay.